Do you know why some souls are born to suffer more than others? Jung believed the answer was never simple. It was never random. It was never meaningless. Pain was not a punishment. It was a map, a signal, a silent invitation from the unconscious. And the people who carry the deepest wounds often look the strongest on the outside. You've seen them. Quiet, steady, focused. They listen more than they speak. They endure more than they reveal. And they smile in ways that confuse you. Because behind that smile there is a storm that never really ends. Jung said the psyche leaves nothing behind. Everything returns. Everything transforms. And everything we refuse to face waits for us in the dark. But strong people learn to keep walking anyway. Most people never notice what happens next. Because strong people, they blight invisibly. They break quietly. They collapse internally while the world celebrates their resilience. And here is where the story darkens. The wounds they carry are not ordinary wounds. They are old, ancestral. They come from childhood. Yes, but also from something deeper. Something Jung called the shadow inheritance. These wounds shape their identity, their destiny, their relationships, their silence, and their strange ability to rise again, even when they are exhausted down to the soul. If you've ever felt older than your own body, if you've ever felt like suffering chose you, not the other way around, then you already know the first wound. You just never had a name for it. There is something dangerous about people who hide their pain so well that even they forget where it started. And here's what Jung found: that almost no one talks about. The unconscious protects you by burying the truth so deep that you start believing the lies you tell yourself. I'm fine. I'm strong. I can do this alone. I don't need anyone. These are not affirmations. They are survival mechanisms. Beautiful on the surface, deadly underneath. Strong people learn to carry their wounds like armor. But armor gets heavy, and sooner or later, the soul begins to speak. Quietly at first, then louder, then in ways you cannot ignore. A strange emptiness, a nervous restlessness, a feeling that you're drifting away from yourself. You go through the motions. You keep your routine, but something in you is tired in a way sleep cannot fix. You start wondering why everyone seems so calm while you feel like you're walking through fog. Most people never realize what happens next, but Jung did. He believed that the strongest souls are chosen, not because they are ready, but because they are capable of surviving what would destroy others. They were shaped by the wound, and the wound became their teacher. And here is the first hidden wound strong people carry. They learn to survive without comfort. Picture it. A child who grows up too fast. A teenager who learns to soothe their own fear. An adult who becomes the rock for everyone else while drowning silently inside themselves. This is the child who never had a soft place to land. The teenager who stayed quiet to avoid conflict. The adult who apologizes for being tired, even when they've given more than anyone else. They don't trust comfort. They don't expect safety. They fear softness because every time they needed it, it wasn't there. So they learned to self-parent, to self-soothe, to self-rescue. They became hyper-independent. Most people call that strength. Jung called it a complex, a wound wearing a mask. And this wound whispers the same lie over and over again. You don't deserve help. This is where the story darkens. The unconscious remembers everything. Every time you cried alone. Every time you hid your fear. Every time you felt abandoned. Unseen. Unheard. Strong people carry these memories not in their mind, but in their body, in their chest, in their shoulders. In the way they inhale before answering someone. In the silence they hold before speaking. They carry an entire childhood inside their posture. And yet they move through life like warriors disguised as ordinary people. But here's what Jung found that no one talks about: the unconscious gives gifts wrapped in the very wounds that hurt you the most. When you learn to live without comfort, you develop perceptiveness, intuition, emotional radar. Strong people can read a room in seconds. They can feel danger before it arrives. They can sense lies before words are spoken. They survived by becoming aware, hyper-aware, almost psychic in the way they anticipate the emotional weather of others. But this gift has a cost. And the cost is always the same: they don't fully know how to receive love. They analyze it. They question it. They wait for it to disappear. And when it stays longer than expected, they become suspicious. Because strong people carry a hidden code inside them. Nothing good lasts. That's how the wound keeps breathing. Most people don't see any of this. They see confidence, calm, maturity, the strong one, the reliable one, the chosen one who always carries everyone's burdens. They see a deeply composed person. What they don't see is the inner child terrified of collapsing. They don't see the longing, the emptiness, the exhaustion, the quiet desperation to finally be held. Not because they are breaking, but because they are simply human. But here's where the shadow twist comes in. When you carry this wound long enough, your identity begins to merge with it. You start believing you don't need softness. You don't need affection. You don't need reassurance. You don't need warmth. And slowly, the soul begins to freeze. This is the dangerous part. Because when a person loses their ability to receive love, something else takes its place: self-sacrifice. You give everything. You shrink your needs. You take the pain of others. You become the healer, the empath, the protector, the strong friend. In every group, you become the one who saves everyone except yourself. You start apologizing for being tired. You stop crying. You stop resting. You stop asking. You stop hoping. But the unconscious is patient, and it waits for the moment when your soul whispers loud enough. Sometimes that whisper comes at night, when you are alone and no one is watching. You sit on your bed. You stare at the wall. The air feels heavy. Your chest feels tight, and you don't even know why. You take a deep breath. You exhale slowly. But the heaviness remains. You don't tell anyone because you don't know how to explain it. This is the first wound, quietly taking shape. And most people never notice what happens next. Because the second hidden wound strong people carry is the wound of emotional invisibility. Jung believed that person becomes invisible not when the world ignores them, but when they learn to ignore themselves. Think about that. You become invisible to others because you became invisible to yourself first. Strong people silence their emotions so effectively that even they forget what they feel. Someone asks them, "Are you okay?" And the automatic answer comes out, "Yeah, I'm good." But that's not the truth. That's the reflex, the survival instinct, the well-practiced mask. You learned this invisibility early. Perhaps in a home where emotions weren't safe, or weren't allowed, or weren't understood. Maybe you felt like a burden when you cried. Maybe you were told to be strong, to be quiet, to be grateful, to stop overreacting. So you learned to disappear emotionally. And here is where the story deepens: invisibility becomes comforting, safe, predictable. You learn to live in the background of your own life. You watch others take space while you shrink yours. You hold your breath when you want to speak. You stay silent when your heart aches for connection. But the soul does not remain silent forever. Jung said, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." And this is the hell part: the moment you realize you've lived your entire life trying not to be a burden. You stop expressing needs. You stop asking for help. You stop showing pain. You only show strength. And people believe it. They believe you don't need them. They believe you're fine on your own. They believe you're invincible. But you're not. You're human. With limits. With tired bones. With a heart that has been stretched too far for too long. Most people never realize what happens next. And this is where Jung's insight cuts deeper the more invisible you become to yourself. The more you attract people who benefit from your invisibility. People who take. People who extract. People who lean on you without offering anything back. You become the listener. Never the one listened to. The healer. Never the one healed. The emotional anchor for everyone. Yet unanchored yourself. This is not weakness. It is a wound that disguised itself as purpose. Invisibility is dangerous because it feels peaceful. You avoid conflict. You avoid disappointment. You avoid betrayal. But you also avoid love. Real love. Love that sees you. Love that holds you. Love that notices the tremble in your voice. Love that says you don't have to be strong tonight. And strong people are haunted by this paradox. They want to be seen. But they also fear being seen. They want connection. But they are terrified of what will happen if someone truly understands them. They want love. But they are afraid it will dissolve the identity they built around strength. This is the second wound. Quiet, heavy, almost impossible to detect from the outside. But the soul keeps record. Every suppressed emotion. Every swallowed truth. Every unspoken hurt. The body remembers. The unconscious remembers. And the shadow waits. But here's what no one expects when the wound of invisibility grows too large. Something awakens inside you. Something restless. Something ancient. Something that refuses to stay silent anymore. And most people never realize what happens next. This is where the story darkens. Because strong people carrying this wound develop an inner split. A part of them is calm, grounded, responsible. And another part of them is starving. Starving for honesty, for expression, for release, for someone to finally say, I see you, not your strength, you. But that recognition rarely comes from the outside. It comes from within. From the moment your shadow steps forward and asks, when did you stop being real? You hesitate. You breathe. You look down. You don't have an answer. And that is the beginning of the awakening. The shadow does not speak to punish you. It speaks to free you. But freedom requires truth. And truth requires visibility. And visibility requires courage. The kind of courage strong people never use for themselves. Only for others. And this is where the tension builds. You start noticing small things. The exhaustion behind your smile. The way you minimize yourself. The way you avoid eye contact when someone compliments you. The way you say, it's fine, even when something's shattered inside. These aren't flaws. These are signals, indicators, messages from the unconscious that your wound is reaching its threshold. Most people never realize what happens next. But you will. Because this is only the beginning. Most people never realize what happens next. But Jung did. And if you've ever felt like life keeps testing you, like the same pain returns in different faces, different situations, different endings, then you're already touching the edge of the third wound. A wound so subtle, so hidden, that even the strongest souls confuse it with fate. But it isn't fate. It is repetition. A cycle. A psychological echo created by the unconscious mind to help you see what you've never dared to face directly. This is the wound of carrying other people's darkness. Strong people rarely collapse because of their own shadows. They collapse because of the shadows they absorb from others. Jung believed that some individuals are born with a strange permeability, a sensitivity that others mistake for empathy. There is empathy. Yes, but it is more than that. It is an open door in the psyche, a doorway that allows the emotions of others to enter you so deeply that your body thinks the pain belongs to you. And here's the dangerous part: you learned to do this long before you even understood what emotions were. Maybe you grew up with a parent whose moods shifted like storms. Maybe you lived in a home where walking on eggshells wasn't a metaphor, but a lifestyle. Maybe you were the child who monitored every adult's energy in the room. Not because you wanted to, but because safety depended on it. You watched. You read their faces. You memorized every tone, every sigh, every quiet tension. You learned to predict emotional danger before it arrived. This is how strong people learn to survive. Vigilance becomes instinct, and instinct becomes identity. Most people never realize how exhausting that is. Strong people aren't just emotionally intelligent. They are emotionally responsible for everyone around them. When someone is upset, they feel obligated to fix it. When someone is angry, they try to calm them. When someone is hurting, they absorb the pain like a sponge. And here's what Jung found: that almost no one talks about. The psyche of a sensitive child expands beyond its own boundaries and becomes the emotional container for the entire environment. You didn't just survive your childhood, you carried it. And now, as an adult, you still carry the unspoken tension of others. You feel responsible for maintaining peace. You feel guilty when others are unhappy. You feel anxious when someone you love withdraws. You feel overwhelmed when people lean on you too heavily. Yet you never say no. You take it all in. Quietly, silently, invisibly. But the unconscious is always aware. It watches. It measures. It waits. And it whispers, "This is not yours." But you don't listen. You can't, because the wound tells you something else. If someone is upset, it must be your fault. That belief has lived inside your body for years. You carry it in your shoulders, in your chest, in the tightness of your stomach when someone's mood changes suddenly. You carry it in your instinct to apologize. You carry it in the way you soften your voice when you feel tension. Most people never realize what happens next, because when you carry other people's darkness long enough, you begin to confuse their shadows with your own. You start believing you are the problem. You internalize blame. You normalize guilt. You expect emotional turbulence. And you become addicted to the role of the healer. Here's the twist Jung warned about: when a person becomes too comfortable carrying the pain of others, they unconsciously attract people who need someone to carry their pain for them. The wounded find the strong. The chaotic find the calm. The broken find the healer. And the healer becomes the sacrificial lamb. Not because they choose it, but because the wound chooses for them. This is how cycles repeat. This is how patterns form. This is how strong people lose themselves. And this is how the third wound takes root. Imagine going through life believing you must fix everything. Imagine believing peace is your responsibility. Imagine believing that other people's happiness depends on you. That's not empathy. That's emotional servitude. That's the shadow at work. That's the dangerous cycle Jung tried to warn us about: the loop where you confuse emotional labor with love. But love is not labor. Love is not sacrifice. Love is not self-erasure. Most people never learn that. Strong people almost never do, because they are raised to believe that strength means holding everything together. That strength means absorbing everything quietly. That strength means carrying emotional weight without trembling. That strength means staying calm while your soul burns. And yet, something in you breaks eventually. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. A fracture. A moment where your energy shifts. A moment where you realize you can't breathe under the weight of emotions that don't even belong to you. This is the moment Jung called the confrontation with the shadow. A moment where the unconscious returns everything you've suppressed. Everything you've absorbed. Everything you never asked for but carried anyway. And when that moment arrives, the soul becomes desperate for separation, for clarity, for truth, for boundaries. But boundaries frighten strong people, not because they are incapable of setting them, but because boundaries threaten the identity they built around being the reliable one, the chosen one, the one who never complains, the one who always understands, the one who always forgives, the one who always stays calm, the one who always gives more than they receive. But here's the dangerous truth: when you always carry more than your share, you attract people who give less than theirs. Not every own, but enough. Enough to drain you. Enough to shape your self-worth. Enough to make you believe you are only valuable when you are useful. Enough to make you forget that your feelings matter just as much. Enough to make you lose parts of yourself in the shadows. Most people never realize what happens next, because when you carry other people's darkness, your own darkness has nowhere to go. It sits inside you. It grows heavier. It grows sharper. It grows louder. And it waits for the moment you can no longer keep pretending. That moment always comes. Maybe it comes on a random night, after an ordinary day, when your body feels inexplicably heavy and your chest aches for no reason. Maybe it comes when someone asks you for something small, and you suddenly feel overwhelmed, like the request is a mountain. Maybe it comes when you're alone in your room, staring at nothing, feeling everything, wondering why your heart feels so tired. Maybe it comes when you realize you've been helping everyone except yourself. This is the third wound speaking. And Jung believed that this wound, if ignored, becomes the catalyst for something even deeper: emotional burnout of the soul. A burnout that doesn't look like crying or breaking down. It looks like numbness, like apathy, like silence, like withdrawal, like the slow fading of your inner light. But the unconscious is not cruel. It is protective. It uses pain to guide you. It uses discomfort to awaken you. It uses exhaustion to tell you your soul is carrying too much. Strong people think they are failing when they feel tired. They think they are weak when they say no. They think they are selfish when they set boundaries. They think they are unkind when they stop rescuing others. But none of this is true. It is the shadow reclaiming space. It is the soul demanding balance. It is the unconscious saying, "This wound has gone too far." Most people never realize what happens next, because the awakening begins quietly. You start noticing who drains you. You start noticing who rarely checks on you. You start noticing who you always comfort, but who never comforts you. You start noticing who apologizes and who doesn't. You start noticing who expects you to be available at all times. You start noticing who uses your strength as an excuse to avoid responsibility. The truth begins to surface. Slowly, softly, inevitably. And when it does, you feel a strange shift inside your chest. A shift that feels like sadness and clarity merging into one. A shift that feels like the beginning of reclaiming your life. This is the beginning of individuation. Not the final stage. Not yet, but the beginning. And most people never realize what happens next, because the moment you start healing this wound, another wound awakens. A wound that lives even deeper. A wound that hides behind the very structure of your personality. A wound that Jung believed was the hardest to face: the wound of self-forgetting. Strong people forget themselves. They forget their dreams, their desires, their voice, their instincts, their boundaries, their emotional truth, their inner child, their original nature, their authentic self. Not deliberately, not consciously, but slowly, gradually, quietly, as a consequence of carrying too much for too long. Self-forgetting doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds over years, decades. It begins with small compromises, tiny silences, little sacrifices, and eventually, You become a version of yourself shaped entirely by what others needed from you. And here's the dark twist at some point. The original self becomes so buried that you can no longer tell the difference between who you truly are and who you became for survival. That is the fourth wound. But you can feel it, even if you can't name it. That dull ache in your chest. That longing for something you can't explain. That sense that a part of you is missing. That emptiness that appears at random moments. That strange nostalgia for a life you've never lived. This is your soul calling you back. Jung believed that self-forgetting is the most dangerous wound because it disconnects you from your destiny. When you forget yourself, you forget your path, your purpose, your instinct, your intuition, your inner voice. You become an actor in your own life, performing someone else's script. You become a shadow of who you could have been. Most people live and die without ever noticing this wound. But strong people feel it. They feel it in their silence. They feel it in their loneliness. They feel it when they stare at the ceiling late at night. They feel it when they realize they don't know what they want anymore. They feel it when they can't recognize their own reflection in the life they built. And this is where the story darkens again. Because when you forget yourself long enough, your shadow steps forward, not to harm you, but to remind you, to awaken you, to show you what you abandoned, to show you what you sacrificed, to show you who you were before the world taught you to be strong. Most people never realize what happens next, but you will. Most people never realize what happens next. But Jung understood that when a person forgets themselves for too long, the psyche responds with a quiet rebellion. It begins subtly, a gentle restlessness, a faint dissatisfaction with things that once felt comforting, a strange distance between you and your own life. You start feeling like a guest inside your routines. You wake up one morning and realize you've been living automatically, like you've been sleepwalking through your own existence. This is the shadow's whisper. Come back. Strong people don't recognize this whisper at first. They confuse it with stress, fatigue, boredom. They blame work, relationships, responsibilities, life changes. They push through it. They stay disciplined. They keep functioning. They don't slow down long enough to hear what the soul is trying to tell them. But the whisper grows. Sometimes it appears as irritation. You get annoyed more easily. You feel impatient. You don't know why. Sometimes it appears as emotional numbness. You're not sad, not happy, just blank. Sometimes it appears as avoidance. You don't want to talk. You don't want to socialize. You don't want to do things you normally enjoy. You feel distant from everyone and everything. Most people never realize what happens next, because the whisper eventually becomes a tremor, a disturbance deep in the psyche, something subtle but unmistakable. And the tremor grows into a pull, a gravitational force urging you inward. Something calls you, not outward into the world, but inward into yourself. Into the forgotten rooms of your own mind, into the neglected corners of your heart, into the abandoned intuition you once trusted before life taught you to silence it. Strong people fear this moment, not because they are weak, but because they are tired. They fear what they will find inside themselves. They fear the truth they've avoided for years. They fear the confrontation Jung spoke of, the moment when the self they became must finally face the self they lost. This is the conflict that defines the fourth wound. The wound of self-forgetting isn't just emotional. It's spiritual. It's psychological. It's existential. It creates a split in the soul. One part of you is responsible, capable, competent, strong, and the other part is raw, vulnerable, unheard, unseen. The unconscious cannot tolerate this split forever. It pushes, it agitates, it disrupts your peace, and it forces you to stop pretending. And this is where the story darkens. Because when the fourth wound awakens, the fifth hidden wound begins to reveal itself in the shadows behind it. A wound so deep, so ancient, so entangled with your destiny that Jung believed it was the true birthplace of individuality. The wound of outgrowing your old self. This wound is quiet. It doesn't hurt like heartbreak. It doesn't ache like loneliness. It doesn't burn like betrayal. It feels more like shedding. Like losing a skin you've worn for too long. Like stepping out of an identity that no longer fits. Like mourning the person you used to be. This wound appears when you finally look at your life with honest eyes. When you realize certain relationships drain you. Certain routines numb you. Certain hopes no longer speak to you. Certain expectations no longer belong to you. And certain versions of yourself must die for a truer version to be born. Most people never realize what happens next. Because outgrowing yourself is terrifying. It means change. It means letting go. It means stepping into the unknown. It means choosing your soul over your comfort. Strong people struggle with this wound more than anyone else. They are so used to being stable, dependable, grounded, predictable, that the idea of transformation feels like chaos. They fear hurting others. They fear disappointing people. They fear losing relationships built on the older version of them. They fear judgment. They fear being misunderstood. But the unconscious doesn't negotiate. When it's time to grow, it pushes. And the push feels like confusion, like indecision, like emotional heaviness, like a life that no longer fits comfortably. It feels like longing, not for something new, but for something real, something aligned, something authentic. This is where the fifth wound begins to show itself more clearly. You feel restless in places that once felt like home. You feel disconnected from patterns you once tolerated. You feel tired of pretending. You feel done with roles that drain you. You feel suffocated by expectations you never agreed to. And you begin to realize that your strength has been used more as a cage than a blessing. Most people never realize what happens next. Because when a strong soul starts outgrowing its old identity, the universe responds. Jung called it synchronicity. Meaningful coincidences, signs, symbols, encounters that feel too intentional to be random. You begin noticing things. Conversations point you in new directions. Dreams become vivid. Old memories resurface. New insights break through. You see patterns with painful clarity, and you feel pulled towards something you cannot yet explain. This is the beginning of psychological rebirth. Not dramatic, not explosive, but slow, gentle, inevitable, like dawn breaking after a long night. The darkness doesn't disappear all at once. It fades gradually, making room for something else, something deeper, something truer. But here's the dangerous twist before you grow into your next self. You must confront the parts of you that refuse to evolve. The caretaker who believes everyone else comes first. The healer who thinks saying no is cruelty. The perfectionist who hides behind competence. The survivor who wants trust softness. The child who swallowed emotions to stay safe. The adult who prioritizes duties over dreams. The shadow who carries everything you abandoned. These parts cling to you. They resist change. They fear the unknown. They whisper old stories. They tell you you're unworthy of peace. They tell you you're selfish for choosing yourself. They tell you you're safe in familiar pain. They tell you transformation is dangerous. And this is the exact moment when strong people fall into emotional limbo. A place between who they were and who they are becoming. A place where old wounds reopen. Not to break you, but to free you. A place where the psyche begins dismantling old structures. A place where you feel lost, confused, detached, overwhelmed. Most people mistake this for depression. Strong people mistake it for failure. Jung knew better. He called it the night sea journey, the descent into the unconscious, the moment the ego dissolves so the self can emerge, a psychological death that precedes rebirth. And here is where the story deepens even more. As you outgrow your old identity, you start seeing the truth behind your wounds. You realize your strength wasn't born from power. It was born from pain. You realize your patience came from silence you endured. You realize your empathy came from hurts you never spoke about. You realize your resilience came from battles you never chose. You realize your calmness came from chaos you survived. You realize your independence came from abandonment. You realize your maturity came from childhood responsibilities. You realize your intuition came from danger you sensed too young. You realize you became strong because you had no other choice. Jung believed that the strongest people are not the ones who endure suffering, but the ones who turn suffering into depth, into wisdom, into consciousness, into compassion, into presence, into resilience. But here's the shadow twist: even depth becomes a burden when it isn't shared. Most strong people suffer alone. They carry their wounds in silence. They hold their tears until the room is empty. They swallow their fears because they don't want to worry anyone. They hide their exhaustion because they don't want to be a burden. They stay calm so others feel safe. They stay understanding so others feel heard. They stay present so others feel supported. But who holds them? Silence is their sanctuary, but also their prison. And that prison becomes unbearable when the fifth wound fully awakens, when the soul begins to outgrow hiding, when the heart begins to crave truth, when the spirit begins to demand alignment, when the shadow refuses to stay in the dark, when the unconscious begins pointing toward a new path. Most people never realize what happens next, because when a strong person reaches this point, they begin their first true inner rebellion. A quiet revolution, a spiritual awakening, a psychological shift that no one else sees, but they feel profoundly. Suddenly, certain things no longer hold power over you. The guilt fades, the fear softens, the old patterns lose grip, the emotional burdens feel heavier than before, the desire for authenticity grows stronger, the longing for inner peace becomes undeniable. You start listening to your intuition again. You start honoring your boundaries. You start recognizing who drains you. You start valuing your energy. You start wanting solitude not to escape, but to reconnect. You start asking yourself questions you never dared to ask. Questions like, what do I actually want? Who am I without responsibility? What version of me is ready to be released? What truth have I been avoiding? What life aligns with my soul? And these questions reveal the final layer of the fifth wound, the realization that the life you built out of survival cannot take you into the life you're meant to live out of truth. Strong people often mistake this moment for falling apart, but Jung believed it is the exact moment you start falling into place. Most people never realize what happens next, because after this comes the turning point, the subtle shift, the internal awakening, the psychological alignment, the soul returning to itself, the shadow integrating, the wounds transforming, the identity changing, the unconscious becoming conscious, the chosen path unfolding. And this is only the beginning of what your psyche is preparing you for. Most people never realize what happens next, but you're not. Most people are you. If you've made it this far, something inside you is already shifting. Something old is cracking. Something buried is rising. Something silent is beginning to speak. Jung believed that when the unconscious finally stops whispering and begins calling you by name, you are standing at the threshold of transformation. And nothing is more dangerous or more beautiful than a soul that reaches this point. This is where every wound you've carried starts working together, not to break you, but to reveal you. to strip away the false layers, to return you to the truth. The truth of who you were before the world taught you to survive instead of live. Most people think healing begins with softness. It doesn't. Healing begins with disruption, with discomfort, with the collapse of the identity you built out of fear. Healing begins when your soul refuses to sit quietly in the life you constructed from wounds. And this is where the story darkens before it lightens. Because when the fifth wound awakens, something unexpected happens. You begin to see your past with painful clarity. You recognize moments where you handed away parts of yourself. You remember times when your silence protected others at the cost of your truth. You see relationships that flourished only because you kept shrinking. You realize how many situations you stayed in because leaving required a version of you that hadn't been born yet. And suddenly, everything makes sense in a way that hurts. This is not regret. This is revelation. Jung said the most profound awakenings come disguised as emotional earthquakes. And that's exactly what the fifth wound feels like. A quiet earthquake. A shift so subtle from the outside, yet so seismic inside that nothing remains untouched. The ego trembles. The shadow rises. The inner child cries. The unconscious opens its doors. And you stand in the middle, feeling everything. Most people panic at this stage. They cling harder to old identities. They run back to familiar pain. They distract themselves with noise, work, relationships, routine, anything to avoid facing the truth. Anything to avoid hearing the shadow say, "Look at what you became to survive." But you are not running. Something in you is done running. Something in you is tired of pretending. Something in you is ready to ask, what if I don't want to live like this anymore? That question is the beginning of rebirth. As you stand in that inner silence, you start feeling the five wounds not as weaknesses, but as messages, each one revealing something essential, each one asking you to see what you once ignored. The first wound whispers you learn to live without comfort, but now you must learn to receive it. The second wound whispers you made yourself invisible to stay safe, but now you must be seen to stay whole. The third wound whispers you carried other people's darkness, but now you must return what was never yours. The fourth wound whispers you forgot yourself to survive, but now you must remember yourself to live. And the fifth wound whispers the final truth: you outgrew your old self, but now you must become your true self. Most people never realize what happens next, because once the wounds speak, something awakens that has been sleeping for years: your instinct. That ancient, primal, intuitive part of you that remembers who you were before fear reshaped you. Strong people often suppress this instinct. They rely on logic, discipline, endurance. They trust their mind more than their heart. But instinct is older than thought, deeper than reason, more honest than survival strategies. And when your instinct awakens, you begin noticing things you never noticed before. You sense when someone's intention no longer aligns with your spirit. You feel when a room drains your energy. You see emotional patterns repeating. You hear lies behind polite words. You sense your own boundaries forming without effort. You feel your intuition rising like a tide. You start trusting the quiet. No, in your chest. You start following the gentle. Yes, in your bones. This is the beginning of internal sovereignty. The moment the soul starts choosing itself. Most people don't like this version of you, because this version of you stops shrinking, stops absorbing, stops carrying, stops apologizing, stops bowing, stops rescuing, stops pretending. This version of you becomes dangerous, not in a harmful way, in a liberated way, in a way that threatens the people who benefited from your silence, in a way that unsettles those who preferred you wounded, in a way that dissolves the dynamics that kept you small. When a strong person finally returns to themselves, The world around them must adjust or fall away. And this is where the shedding begins. People whose presence once felt comforting suddenly feel heavy. Responsibility that once felt noble starts feeling draining. Roles you once fulfilled start feeling misaligned. Conversations that once filled you now leave you empty. Connections you once protected begin slipping from your hands. Places you once stayed now feel too small for your spirit. You're not losing these things. You're outgrowing them. Jung believed the psyche expands like a tree. Roots first, into darkness, then upward, toward light. And the moment expansion begins, anything that restricts growth must fall away. This is why strong people experience sudden life shifts, breakdowns, breakthroughs, revelations, endings, awakenings. It isn't chaos. It's alignment. And alignment always begins in the shadows. Most people never realize what happens next, because once you reclaim yourself, the unconscious begins guiding you with startling precision. Old memories surface not to hurt you, but to free you. Emotional patterns reveal themselves not to shame you, but to teach you. Signs appear. You meet people who mirror new truths. You feel drawn toward paths that once terrified you. You sense doors closing with unusual clarity, and you feel new doors forming quietly, mysteriously, beyond your old limits. This stage feels like walking through fog, but with a strange sense of direction. You don't know where you're going, but you know where you can't stay. It feels like returning home to a place you've never been. It feels like remembering something you've never learned. It feels like stepping into a life your soul always knew was waiting. Most people never reach this stage because they fear losing the version of themselves the world knows. But the world doesn't need your old self. The world needs your awakened self. The self you buried. The self you silenced. The self you abandoned. The self that is rising now. And here is where the story softens for the first time. Because even though the journey is dark, even though the wounds are heavy, something else appears in the quiet moments between breaths. Something warm, something ancient, something steady. A presence, your presence, the part of you that never broke. The part of you that watched silently through every wound. The part of you that knows exactly who you are. The part of you Jung called the self. And the self whispers something simple, something powerful, something you weren't ready to hear until now. You were never broken. You were becoming. Most people never realize what happens next, because after the internal shift comes the external shift. Your choices change. Your voice changes. Your posture changes. Your relationships change. Your boundaries become real. Your intuition sharpens. Your heart feels different. Your mind feels clearer. Your energy becomes selective. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop tolerating emotional imbalance. You stop fighting for people who won't meet you halfway. You stop saving those who refuse to save themselves. You stop explaining your pain to those who benefit from misunderstanding you. And something incredible happens. Life stops draining you and starts responding to you. People who once overlooked you begin feeling uneasy around your new presence. People who once used you can no longer access you. People who once underestimated you sense your transformation. People who once controlled you lose their power. People who once took advantage of you start falling away. Not because you changed suddenly, because you finally ended the performance. Strong people often fear this stage. They fear letting go. They fear disappointing others. They fear being alone. But listen carefully. The moment you stop abandoning yourself, loneliness dissolves. Because for the first time, you are with you, your true self, your forgotten self, your liberated self. And this is where the fifth wound transforms into your greatest strength, the ability to walk forward without carrying the ghosts of who you used to be. Most people never realize what happens next, But Jung did. He believed that the soul waits patiently for the moment you are ready to return to yourself. And when you finally do, you become one of the chosen, not chosen by fate, not chosen by destiny, chosen by your own courage to face what others avoid, chosen because you survived the darkness without losing your light, chosen because you carried wounds that refined you, chosen because you walked through pain that deepened you, chosen because you endured what would break most people, chosen because you refused to remain invisible to your own soul. You were chosen the moment you decided not to collapse. You were chosen the moment you decided to rise. You were chosen the moment you decided that your story wasn't over. And now, everything changes. As you take your next breath, something in you settles. Something aligns. Something opens. You feel the truth pulse in your chest. You are no longer the person shaped by wounds. You are the person shaped by awakening. You are no longer carrying the past. You are carrying power, depth, awareness, consciousness, presence. You are becoming the most dangerous version of yourself, the version who remembers who they are. And in this final moment, in this quiet turning point, your soul finally says what it's been waiting to say all along. You are ready. Now, breathe. You already know what comes next. If this message found you at the right moment, subscribe for the next awakening.